Hi. We come to the end of Genesis 13 today with Yahweh's speech to Abram and Abram's action response, if not verbal response. And actually, as we'll see, it's not clear it's a response or just an independent action. So to put us in the narrative context of where we are in chapter 13, it began with this potential strife between Abram's herders and Lot's herders over the lack of sufficient grazing land and food for the animals. And Abram proposed that Lot choose whichever direction he wants to go, and Lot looked out and saw something like the garden of God and moved towards Sodom. And it simply said that Abram then settled in Sodom, or settled in Canaan, and Lot settled in Sodom. And then the scene you see on the left side of the screen begins out of nothing right there. Yahweh said to Abram. So for the third time, Yahweh is speaking to Abram, and again, Abram will not respond. Let's put this in the larger context of our story. We've been looking from chapter 12 forward on this invitations, promises, and responses throughout this whole section. And so we've looked in depth at 12:1-4, the initial call to go, and the promises there. And now we're on the second one, where there's not a new promise exactly. He was told earlier to make you a great nation, which is, of course, about the same as saying, I will make your offspring numerous. There was no promise of the land up in the first one, though, and now there's a specific promise of land and offspring. And so we'll look at that more closely in just a minute. And to focus it more specifically, I extracted from that wider list of promises and framed it a little differently, divine promises of children and land in the Abraham-Sarah story cycle. And I want to highlight that especially because, as I was saying 2 videos ago, many scholars look at this section as the theme of whether Lot will be the promised heir that Yahweh had suggested was going to be the line between Abram and the descending generations, which would become this great nation. But as we've been looking at and using the work of Dan Rickett as well 2 videos ago, we can see that really that's not the theme at all. The theme is land and the question of fulfilling the promise to let go of the people that he'd been with before, Lot being the last remaining one of those. So we see that here. And then just looking ahead, we see further promises in 15 and 16. 15 to Abram, and 16, curiously, to Hagar. I will so greatly multiply your offspring, they cannot be counted for multitude. And then continuing in 17, still no Isaac has been born yet. Another promise to Abram that there would be offspring and land. And then in 21, when Abraham at that point thinks it might be Ishmael, God tells him not to be distressed, there will be another child. And then finally there is another child who's almost dead, but then there's a further promise. So in light of those, our current passage is situated on a string of divine promises to Abram, and we'll see some frustration in Abram that they're not being fulfilled right away, but mostly he just sits there and listens, or at least is silent, as we're going to see here. Let's return also to our key words passage, version of the passage here, so we can see we're down in this section here, down near the bottom. And again, the land is the focus, the green being the color here for land elements. And you can see this whole second section is all about the land once the strife of being too close together was removed. So let's look at the atlas for a moment just to see where we are. We're gathered here in Bethel, and in a minute we'll look at another picture to be able to see perhaps something like what Abram saw. So Yahweh says to Abram, after Lot had separated, notice that's key here, that Yahweh had either not spoken to Abram before Lot had separated, or Abram wasn't listening for Yahweh's voice. Abram has not made a choice directly here other than the choice to say that they should separate. But once that happens, Yahweh speaks to him. And he says, raise your eyes, or literally, lift your eyes, please. Again, another please, as we've seen pleases before, as Abram's pleased twice to Lot about separating, because he knew it would be a harsh thing to go on without the rest of his family. But Yahweh does it here, not because it's a harsh command. It's actually not a command at all, but simply a promise. So lift your eyes, please, and look from the place where you are now. So let's have this image from Google Maps, which, as you see, is from Bethel looking out, and of course it's from an elevated area, and Abram couldn't see it from there, but to give some sense of perhaps what he might be looking. And we know he's looking that direction from the Hebrew of the words later in this verse, as we'll look at in a second. He's looking east. So lift up your eyes and look from the place, Makom, as we saw echoing a place earlier in the chapter, where you are, northward, which is Saphona. And then you can see them all down here. Negeb, as we've seen, is the word for south. Kedem, meaning in front, and then Yam, meaning the sea. So in front if something's in front of him and Yam is behind him, then the sea is to the west and front is to the east. So you can see that now on this picture looking from this angle. So look at all the land that you see, I will give to you. Is that really possible? What were original readers supposed to imagine the scope of all the land that you can see from this place is? Plainly, all the land you can see from there is bigger than the historical Judah that Jerusalem was a part of, that presumably the people who were writing from Babylonian exile had known before the exile, if they're still the ones who were alive, or if these are people born in exile in Babylon who've never seen the land at all and would have no idea what it would look out. But it's certainly a wide open promise. All the land that you see I will give to you. And then it goes on, and to your offspring forever, using the common Hebrew phrase here, ad olam, into eternity or into forever, into everything. So an eternal promise, and of course it's part of that promise that's led to the ongoing conflict with Israelis and Palestinians to this day in that land. Because if you take this as a literal promise from the Creator to Abram and all his descendants, you have a problem with what other people might be doing there. But there are also other versions of this promise we'll see, and plainly those can't be taken literally, so we'll take this within the hyperbolic and an unclear description of all the land that you can see that's inherent in this way of framing it. So that about the land, and now about the progeny. I will make your offspring, again using seed 59 times in Genesis. One of several abundant metaphors from earth for offspring. We see seed, stars, and sand. And perhaps for those of us who live in urban areas, we can't quite see the stars spread out across the sky as we might see sand on the beach, or seeds within a flower or agricultural context, like wheat seeds perhaps. But of course they could. They did not have the urban night pollution that we have. So whether you look at the sky or the ground or the fields, you will see images of abundance that your offspring will be like. And again, noting, as throughout Genesis, that human fertility and land fertility and animal fertility are all part of the same pattern. So seed for plants, for animals, and for humans produce more. Like the dust of the earth, literally like the dust of the land, ha'eretz, why the translators make it earth here when it's land throughout, the same as land right here, not clear. But like dust of the earth, afar, which is the very stuff from chapter 2 that humans were made from back here in the beginning, and also the place to which they will return after the curse on people and the sentence to agriculture there. So I will make you like the dust from which you came, the dust of the earth, so that if one could count the dust of the earth, your offspring also can be counted. And you can see here that these little verses form a little ABBA chiasm, little Abba chiasm there, with the exact symmetry there of dust of the earth, the offspring, and the land that I will give you. And then similarly in verse 17, and given the northward, south, east, and west there, it says rise up. Again, we could perhaps put a chiasm around this whole thing that way if we want. Walk through the length and breadth of the land. Length is only in 6:15, and so is breadth only in 6:15 for describing the ark. So one could suggest here the land is taking place of the ark as a place of refuge from the violence and destruction that may be around them amongst the Canaanites and Perizzites, although we haven't seen anything to suggest that they're violent, as we saw in chapter 6, when God saw that all humans had corrupted the earth with their violence. And so we get to our final verse of our section for today, and although the New RSV has so, making it a causal response, in the Hebrew it's just va and. So there is no immediate causal response, and Abram moved his tent. And there's no particular reason to think that that would be the response, given what Yahweh has said here, that there's a need to move. He's already in the land that's been given, so why should he move his tent from Bethel, looking back here, from Bethel down to Mamre? It's not clear at all, other than the fact that there's a nice shade trees there. Notice it's plural here, ve'oni, so the trees of Mamre, and one can look and see a tree that purports to be the ancient tree, but of course there's no way to prove that in that site. And the one that's there now is just a scrap, so it's not worth particularly seeing. But if you saw the one from the beginning of this chapter, where they said by the other tree described as a terebinth or an oak, you can see the kind of wide shade tree that would be an attractive place. And literally it says he sat by. Sarai. The word for settled is usually sat by that. Notice that Sarai is completely absent from this scene. There's no sense that she's even there. Abram moved his tent, not their tent. This scene is just about him and Lot. After all, it said, are we not men brothers? And so the women are excluded from this issue of the land. And as we'll see, that's a function of a version of patriarchy that was understood in the ancient world where, and we'll talk about this more later, where men had power over the external world and women had power over the internal world. So we'll see later inside the tent, Sarai, later Sarah, can give Abram instructions and he follows them without question. But in the outside world, the men have the authority. And I also want to note, while we're talking about that theme, that this patriarchy is not made by God. This patriarchy is part of the curse, part of the sentence for disobedience in the garden. That the man was sentenced to struggle with the earth for food, although these people are not doing that here. They're not engaging in agriculture. And the women are sentenced to many childbirths, thanks to Carol Meyer's understanding, not just painful childbirths, but the many childbirths that go along with agriculture and patriarchy. And so what we're seeing is life outside the garden under the curse, which is not the way God wants it to be. And eventually there'll be much later texts that suggest a reversal of the curse, especially through the death and resurrection of Jesus for people who engage the New Testament as part of their scriptural canon. So he settled here by the oaks of Mamre, which are at Hebron. And you can see from this little map here from Google Maps, it's a good ways. That's a good ways for him to travel from Bethel to Hebron. And why there? Not clear. How would he have known? It didn't say he went through there on the first trip. Seemed like he was more along the coast in a Gerar, but maybe he was there and we just didn't hear about it. And there he built his third altar to Yahweh. And that will set us up for a whole different chapter in a way, a war story between 5 kings and 4 kings that some scholars have seen as a foreign intrusion, but we'll see the key to the story is the taking captive and the attempt to release Lot by his uncle Abraham. So Lot's not quite out of the story yet. We'll see you next time for that. Bye-bye.